The plasma torch flickered and died in Elena's hands for the third time that evening, leaving her workshop bathed in the pale blue glow of emergency lighting. She muttered a string of creative curses in 3 different languages, a skill she'd picked up during her years bouncing between colonies, and gave the torch a percussive maintenance tap that would have made her engineering professors weep. "Come on, you temperamental piece of recycled scrap," she coaxed, shaking the device like a maraca. "We've got bills to pay and armor to fix, and I'm not about to let a glorified cigarette lighter ruin my evening." The torch sputtered back to life with all the enthusiasm of a dying star, casting dancing shadows across the cluttered workbench where various pieces of military hardware lay in states of surgical disassembly. Elena had been running Outpost Kepler-7's only legitimate repair shop for 18 months now, ever since the colonial defense budget had been slashed and proper maintenance crews became as rare as decent coffee beans this far from Earth. The workshop door chimed softly, its sensors detecting movement in the corridor beyond. Elena glanced at the chronometer display floating above her workstation, 20:47 hours, well past official closing time. She'd left the door unlocked purely out of habit, the same way she left a pot of synthetic coffee brewing all night. On Kepler-7, desperate soldiers needing emergency repairs didn't follow business hours any more than plasma storms followed weather forecasts. "We're technically closed," she called out, not looking up from the power coupling she was attempting to resurrect, "but if you're bleeding or your life support is failing, I suppose I can make an exception. Fair warning though. My bedside manner gets worse after 2,000 hours, and I charge double for sob stories." The visitor stepped into the workshop circle of light, and Elena's peripheral vision caught the familiar silhouette of standard-issue combat armor. Battle-scarred ceramic plating, reinforced joints, integrated weapon hardpoints, all the usual features that made colonial defense forces look like walking tanks and sound like malfunctioning percussion sections when they moved. "Let me guess," Elena continued, finally glancing up with a practiced smile that had disarmed countless stressed soldiers, "plasma rifle overheated during combat drills, or did someone try to use their armor's chest plate as a beer opener again? Because I'm telling you right now, warranty fraud is still fraud even if it's technically creative problem solving." The woman standing in her doorway remained silent, but something in her stillness made Elena pause. Most soldiers who stumbled into her shop carried themselves with the particular brand of exhausted swagger that came from surviving another day in humanity's ongoing experiment with interstellar colonization. This one stood differently, not with fatigue, but with a kind of patient observation that made Elena suddenly aware of how her workshop must look to outside eyes. Tools scattered across every surface like metallic confetti, spare parts organized according to a system that made sense only to Elena herself, walls covered with technical schematics that served double duty as motivational posters and burn pattern analysis charts. Her coffee mug, decorated with the faded logo of her old university, sat precariously balanced on a stack of repair manuals that had seen better decades. "Right, strong silent type," Elena said, setting down her plasma torch and wiping her hands on a rag that had given up any pretense of cleanliness sometime during the previous administration. "I can work with that. What's the damage assessment?" The woman stepped forward into the full light, and Elena got her first clear look at the armor in question. Her eyebrows climbed toward her hairline as she took in the details. This wasn't standard colonial military issue. The design was sleeker, more organic, with flowing lines that suggested the armor had been grown rather than manufactured. Scorch marks across the chest piece told stories of energy weapons that packed considerably more punch than anything in the colonial arsenal. "Well, that's interesting," Elena muttered, circling the woman with the focused attention of a scientist who just discovered something that wasn't supposed to exist. "This is some seriously advanced biotech integration. Neural interface ports, adaptive plating, what looks like a self-repair matrix that's currently throwing error codes." She paused, squinting at a particularly complex-looking component. "Either you're from one of those classified research divisions nobody talks about, or you've been shopping at stores that don't advertise in standard databases. Either way, I'm impressed and slightly terrified, which is pretty much my default state these days." The woman tilted her head slightly, and Elena caught a glimpse of features that seemed almost familiar yet somehow different in ways she couldn't quite identify. Sharp cheekbones, pale skin that suggested limited exposure to Kepler-7's harsh twin suns, and eyes that held depths Elena's engineer brain warned her not to think about too hard during working hours. The power distribution network appears to be cascading failures through the primary systems. The woman spoke for the first time, her voice carrying an accent Elena couldn't place despite her extensive experience with colonial dialects. Restoration of full functionality would be appreciated. Elena grinned, the expression transforming her grease-smudged face into something considerably more mischievous. Appreciated, she says. Lady, I don't know where you picked up this particular piece of military haute couture, but whoever built it clearly believed in the, if you have to ask the price, you can't afford it, school of engineering. This is going to be fun. She gestured toward the examination platform that dominated the center of her workshop, its surface covered with diagnostic sensors and holographic projectors that could map molecular structures with obsessive precision. Let's get you out of that armor and see what we're really dealing with. Fair warning, my diagnostic systems are chattier than a politician during election season, so expect some colorful commentary from the computer while we work. 3 hours into the repair work, Elena had consumed enough synthetic coffee to power a small orbital station and discovered that the armor's quantum matrix was more temperamental than her ex-husband's mother. The diagnostic hologram floating above her workbench painted a picture of technology that shouldn't have existed outside of theoretical physics journals, complete with self-healing nanotechnology that seemed to have developed something resembling a personality disorder. Okay, so here's what I'm seeing, Elena announced to her silent patient, who had been observing the repair process with the intensity of someone watching their life savings being juggled by a caffeinated monkey. Your armor's nanobots are having what I can only describe as an existential crisis. They're trying to repair damage that was inflicted by weapons that operate on principles my equipment can barely recognize, let alone understand. She gestured at the swirling mass of data streams cascading through the holographic display, each line of code representing billions of microscopic machines working in concert. It's like trying to fix a broken heart with a wrench made of pure mathematics. Theoretically possible, but it requires a certain creative approach to the laws of physics. The woman shifted slightly, and Elena caught another glimpse of those unusually elongated ears. Colonial genetic modification programs had produced all sorts of variations over the centuries, enhanced lung capacity for thin atmospheres, improved radiation resistance, even aesthetic modifications that ranged from practical to completely bizarre. Elena had once repaired armor for a soldier whose genetic profile included gills, though he'd assured her they were purely decorative after a rather memorable shore leave on an aquatic world. You know what the funny thing is? Elena continued, using a quantum resonance calibrator to coax the armor's power systems back into alignment. I used to be a respectable researcher. Dr. Elena Vasquez, published in 12 peer-reviewed journals, guest lecturer at the Martian Institute of Technology. Had a nice office with a view of the terraforming processors, a lab full of graduate students who hung on my every word, and a pension plan that would have made a colonial administrator weep with envy. The nanobots responded to her adjustments with something that looked suspiciously like gratitude, their collective behavior shifting from chaotic desperation to organized cooperation. Elena had seen similar patterns in organic neural networks, but never in artificial systems. The boundaries between technology and biology seemed to blur in ways that made her former colleagues would have either celebrated or reported to the appropriate authorities. Then the budget cuts hit, she continued, her hands moving with practiced precision through the armor's internal systems. Turns out, pure research doesn't generate immediate profits, and immediate profits are apparently more important than understanding the fundamental nature of reality. Who knew? So here I am, using a PhD in quantum engineering to fix holes in military hardware while living in what used to be a supply closet. The woman finally spoke, her melodic voice cutting through Elena's rambling monologue like a laser through butter. Your research focused on quantum consciousness interfaces. Elena's hands froze mid-calibration, a chill running down her spine that had nothing to do with the workshop's inadequate heating system. The question was too specific, too knowing, carrying implications that made her scientific curiosity war with her survival instincts. That's oddly specific, she managed, forcing her voice to remain casual while her mind raced through possibilities. Most people's eyes glaze over when I mention quantum anything. Usually, I get responses like, "Can you fix my gun?" or "How much will this cost?" or "Please stop explaining the theoretical foundations of reality while I'm bleeding." She resumed her work, but with heightened awareness of every sound, every movement, every fluctuation in the workshop's environmental systems. The armor's bioneural interfaces were responding to the repairs in ways that suggested a level of integration between machine and wearer that shouldn't have been possible with current human technology. "Your techniques suggest familiarity with non-human technological principles," the woman observed, her tone carrying the weight of scientific curiosity rather than casual conversation. "Well, that's a terrifying sentence," Elena replied, injecting humor into her voice to mask the growing unease. "Are you suggesting that my repair methods are so unconventional they appear alien? Because I have to tell you, that's either the best compliment or the most disturbing accusation I've received this week, and this week included a drunk soldier who insisted I'd stolen his lucky socks." The quantum resonance calibrator chimed softly, indicating successful synchronization between the armor's various subsystems. Elena watched as damaged components began regenerating at the molecular level, the nanobots working with an efficiency that seemed almost eager. The scorch marks across the chest piece faded like time-lapse footage of healing wounds. "There we go," she announced with satisfaction, stepping back to admire her work. "Your armor's nanobots are back in business, though I have to say, they've got some unusual programming. Most military nanites are about as sophisticated as smart paint, but these little guys seem to have opinions about their work." The woman stood, testing the armor's mobility with fluid movements that seemed to defy the bulky appearance of the protective systems. Every servo responded instantly, every joint moved with organic grace, as if the boundary between flesh and machine had been erased entirely. "The repairs are exceptional," she said, and Elena detected something in her voice that might have been surprise. "Your understanding of bioneural integration exceeds what should be possible given your species' current technological development." Elena's coffee mug slipped from her suddenly nerveless fingers, shattering against the workshop floor in a cascade of ceramic shards and lukewarm synthetic caffeine. The phrase, "your species," echoed in her mind like an alarm bell, carrying implications that her rational, scientific worldview wasn't quite ready to process. Dawn crept across Outpost Kepler 7 with all the enthusiasm of a hungover administrator, painting the sky in shades of amber and rust that reminded Elena why she'd never been a morning person. She stood in the workshop doorway, nursing her fourth cup of synthetic coffee and watching her mysterious client test the repaired armor in the courtyard beyond. The woman moved like liquid mercury given human form, each step flowing into the next with a grace that made Elena's engineering brain itch with curiosity. "You know," Elena called out, leaning against the doorframe with practiced casualness, "most people test their equipment by checking if the lights turn on and the servos respond. You're out there conducting what looks like an interpretive dance routine. Should I be charging extra for the entertainment value?" The woman paused mid-movement, turning toward Elena with an expression that might have been amusement. The morning light caught her features differently, highlighting the subtle angles of her face and the way her unusually elongated ears curved with an elegance that seemed almost deliberately sculpted. Elena had initially dismissed them as another colonial genetic variation, but something about their proportions nagged at her scientific sensibilities. "The armor's neural interface requires comprehensive calibration," the woman replied, executing a series of movements that flowed from combat stances to what looked like ceremonial gestures. "Each system must integrate properly with biological functions." "Right, biological integration," Elena nodded sagely, taking another sip of coffee that tasted like burnt optimism. "Because nothing says routine equipment testing like performing what appears to be an ancient ritual in my parking lot. Next you'll be telling me the armor requires daily meditation and a subscription to philosophical journals." The courtyard began to fill with early shift personnel making their way to various duties around the outpost. Colonial military life started before most people remembered they had consciousness, a tradition that Elena suspected had been designed by the same sadistic minds that invented mandatory physical fitness evaluations and nutritional supplements that tasted like liquefied cardboard. Sergeant Torres emerged from the barracks building, scratching his jaw and looking like he'd been personally insulted by the concept of mourning. He spotted Elena and raised a hand in greeting, then noticed her client and stopped mid-wave, his expression shifting from sleepy annoyance to something approaching confusion. "Morning, Doc," he called out, but his eyes remained fixed on the woman in the courtyard. "That's some serious hardware your customer's sporting. Looks like it could punch through a battle cruiser's hull plating." "Yeah, well, you know me," Elena replied with forced lightness, noting how Torres seemed unable to look away from her client. "I attract all the interesting cases. Last week it was a guy whose armor had developed a gambling addiction. The week before that, someone whose neural implant kept playing elevator music during combat situations. More soldiers began to gather, drawn by that peculiar magnetism that military personnel seem to possess for anything unusual or potentially dangerous." Elena watched with growing unease as conversations died mid-sentence, replaced by an electric tension that made her skin crawl. The morning banter that usually filled the courtyard, complaints about the food, speculation about leave schedules, increasingly creative descriptions of the local weather, faded into an expectant silence. Lieutenant Chen stepped out of the communications center, his usual hurried stride slowing as he caught sight of the woman. His datapad slipped from suddenly nerveless fingers, clattering against the metal decking with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the growing quiet. "Is it just me," Elena muttered to herself, "or is everyone acting like they've just spotted their first-grade teacher naked? Because this level of collective awkwardness is approaching performance art." The woman continued her movements, seemingly oblivious to the gathering crowd, but Elena noticed subtle changes in her bearing. The fluid testing motions evolved into something more formal, more purposeful, as if she were responding to some invisible protocol that only she could perceive. Her posture straightened, taking on an authority that transformed her from an anonymous soldier into something that demanded attention. Private Morrison, fresh out of basic training and still young enough to believe that military service would involve more heroic adventures and fewer equipment inspections, stepped closer to get a better view. His eager expression crumbled into something approaching awe, and he took an involuntary step backward as if he'd suddenly remembered an urgent appointment elsewhere. "Okay, this is getting seriously weird," Elena announced to no one in particular, her voice carrying across the courtyard with the authority of someone who'd spent years teaching undergraduates and knew how to project when necessary. "It's like you've all seen a ghost, except ghosts don't usually require armor repairs and synthetic coffee. Also, ghosts don't tip, which would be a significant business concern if I were running a supernatural customer service operation." Captain Williams emerged from the command center, his usual parade ground confidence faltering as his gaze fell upon the woman. Elena had known Williams for over a year, had seen him face down everything from equipment failures to minor alien wildlife incidents with unflappable military composure. Now he stood frozen like a statue of martial bewilderment, his mouth slightly open as if he'd forgotten how to complete the process of breathing. The woman turned toward the assembled crowd, her movements flowing with newfound purpose. When she straightened to her full height, Elena felt something shift in the very air around them, as if reality itself had decided to pay closer attention to whatever was about to happen. The morning light seemed to gather around her figure, and Elena found herself thinking of old stories about beings who could command the attention of mortals simply by choosing to be noticed. "You know what?" Elena said, her voice pitched higher than usual as nervous energy coursed through her system. "I'm starting to think I should have stayed in bed this morning. Or possibly last week. Maybe even last year when I was still foolishly optimistic about the predictability of basic human behavior." The silence stretched like a held breath, pregnant with possibilities that Elena's rational mind refused to contemplate. Whatever was happening in her courtyard, it was clearly beyond the scope of routine equipment maintenance and into territory that her engineering degree hadn't prepared her to navigate. The moment stretched like elastic reality until it snapped with devastating precision. Every soldier in the courtyard dropped to their knees in perfect unison, their heads bowed in a gesture of reverence that made Elena's coffee-addled brain struggle to process what she was witnessing. The sound of armored knees hitting metal decking created a percussion symphony that would have been comical if it hadn't been so utterly terrifying. "Well," Elena said, her voice barely above a whisper, "that's not something you see every Tuesday." Or any day, really. I'm pretty sure my insurance doesn't cover spontaneous military genuflection in the workplace. She stood frozen in her doorway, clutching her coffee mug like a lifeline while her rational mind performed impressive gymnastics trying to explain the impossible scene before her. Sergeant Torres, who had once faced down a pack of carnivorous alien flora with nothing but harsh language and a plasma rifle, knelt with tears streaming down his weathered face. Lieutenant Chen, whose emotional range typically extended from mildly annoyed to severely annoyed, trembled as if he'd witnessed the fundamental nature of existence reveal itself during his morning routine. The woman turned toward Elena with fluid grace, her movement carrying an authority that seemed to bend space-time around her presence. Those elongated ears, which Elena had dismissed as colonial genetic modification, now seemed to glow with their own inner light, casting subtle shadows that defied the morning sun's angle. Her eyes held depths that made Elena think of star charts and navigation routes through dimensions that didn't have names in any human language. You know, Elena managed, forcing her voice to maintain its customary irreverence even as reality crumbled around her like a poorly constructed theory. When I got into equipment repair, nobody mentioned that customer service might involve encounters with beings who inspire mass religious experiences. That's definitely not covered in the standard technical manuals. The woman approached with steps that seemed to make the very air shimmer, each footfall creating ripples in what Elena's scientific mind insisted should be empty space. When she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that resonated in frequencies human ears weren't designed to perceive, yet somehow Elena understood every word with crystalline clarity. Your assistance has been invaluable, Dr. Elena Vasquez, she said, and Elena felt her worldview collapse and reassemble itself in the space between heartbeats. The armor you repaired belonged to a reconnaissance unit that has been observing your species for several generations. Your technical expertise exceeded all projections for human technological development. Several generations, Elena repeated numbly, then let out a laugh that bordered on hysteria. Of course. Why would I assume this was just another Tuesday involving routine equipment maintenance? That would be far too simple for my increasingly complicated existence. The woman reached into a compartment in her armor and withdrew something that looked like crystallized starlight shaped into geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly. Elena's engineering instincts recognized it as technology, but technology that operated on principles her education had never covered and her imagination had never dared to contemplate. Your understanding of quantum consciousness interfaces suggests a natural aptitude for technologies that bridge organic and synthetic systems, the woman continued, offering the crystalline device to Elena. This is a translation matrix that will allow you to comprehend the technical specifications for systems that your species will not develop for several centuries. Elena stared at the offered device, her scientific curiosity warring with her increasingly frayed sense of self-preservation. Let me see if I understand this correctly. You're offering me alien technology that will expand my understanding of the universe, probably revolutionize human civilization, and definitely complicate my tax returns beyond all reasonable limits. Essentially, yes. And in exchange for fixing your armor, which I now realize was probably worth more than this entire outpost, you're upgrading my brain to comprehend impossible mathematics and engineering principles that violate everything I learned in graduate school. That is an accurate summary. Elena looked around the courtyard at the soldiers who remained kneeling in reverent silence, then back at the being who had somehow managed to masquerade as just another customer in need of routine repairs. She thought about her former life as a respectable researcher, her current existence as a military contractor with a caffeine addiction, and the entirely unpredictable future that was apparently opening before her like a door to dimensions she'd never imagined. You know what the really funny thing is, she said, reaching out to accept the crystalline device. I was actually having a perfectly ordinary evening until you showed up. My biggest concern was whether I had enough synthetic coffee to last through another night of equipment repairs. Now I'm apparently being recruited into some kind of interstellar technology exchange program by what I'm assuming is alien royalty. The device felt warm in her hands, its crystalline structure pulsing with internal light that seemed to sync with her heartbeat. Elena felt knowledge flowing into her consciousness like water filling an empty vessel, technical specifications and engineering principles that redefined her understanding of what was possible. The universe is considerably more complex than your species currently comprehends, the woman said, her form beginning to shimmer with the same ethereal quality as her voice. But your natural curiosity and innovative approach to problem-solving suggest that humanity may be ready for broader participation in galactic civilization. Elena felt the changes beginning in her mind, new pathways of understanding opening like flowers blooming in fast forward. She could suddenly perceive the quantum foundations of matter, the elegant mathematics that governed faster-than-light travel, and the bioneural integration principles that made truly advanced artificial intelligence possible. Well, she said, grinning despite the magnitude of what was happening to her, I always wanted to expand my technical expertise. Though I have to say, this is taking continuing education to entirely new levels. I hope there's a decent pension plan for interdimensional engineering consultants.